The rain had been falling for hours, a steady curtain that turned the dirt roads of the valley into a mess of sucking mud and treacherous puddles, yet no one in Alpha Squad dared to complain. The war had been dragging on for months, each day blending into the next with ambushes, night raids and desperate firefights, and the men had grown accustomed to misery, but there was something about tonight that felt different. They were crouched in the ruins of a collapsed farmhouse, shivering in the damp cold, their rifles resting across their knees while they waited for orders. The silence was broken only by the occasional groan of timber beams shifting under the weight of the storm. Among them sat their mentor, Sergeant Elias Ward, a quiet man with eyes so sharp and calm that it unsettled even the veterans. He was not one for speeches, nor did he waste words on unnecessary chatter. His method of teaching was observation, correction, and repetition until muscle memory became instinct. To the younger soldiers, Ward was a mystery, an older marksman with graying stubble and a scar that ran from his temple to his jawline. He never spoke of his past, never hinted at where he had learned the things he knew, but his skill with a rifle was beyond question. When he corrected their grip, adjusted their breathing, or scolded them for breaking focus, it was with the authority of someone who had walked the edge of life and death more times than they could imagine. They whispered among themselves when he was not listening, trading rumors and half-jokes about who he might have been before the army found him. Some said he had once been part of an elite unit that vanished from the records. Others swore he was retired until the war reignited and he was dragged back into service. Whatever the truth was, no one really cared because in every skirmish, every ambush, and every desperate retreat, Ward's guidance kept them alive. The mission that night was supposed to be routine, an infiltration to disrupt an enemy supply convoy expected to move through the valley before dawn. They had done it before, setting mines, waiting in the dark, striking fast, and vanishing before reinforcements could respond. But as Ward scanned the ridgeline through his binoculars, the storm pouring down his hood, he frowned in that way that made the men uneasy. He handed the binoculars to their captain, a young officer barely in his late 20s, who tried to match the older man's patience but lacked his instincts. "Convoy's not moving right," Ward muttered. "Too many scouts. Too much radio chatter. They're baiting us." The captain hesitated, unsure whether to call off the mission, but before he could speak, distant headlights cut through the sheets of rain, a staggered line of armored vehicles crawling along the flooded road. Alpha Squad slipped into position, hearts pounding, rifles ready, but Ward's expression never changed. He crouched at the edge of the ruins, his long rifle resting against the bricks, his hands steady despite the cold. The squad waited for the signal, each man's nerves strung tight as wire, but Ward's gaze never left the ridgeline. Something was wrong, and though the others could not see it, he could. His silence stretched long enough that the captain grew restless. "Sergeant," the officer whispered sharply, "we're losing the window." Ward did not answer immediately. He was watching the shadows beyond the convoy, the way the trees swayed in unnatural rhythm, the flicker of movement that had nothing to do with the storm. When he finally spoke, his words were like ice. "They know we're here. Hold your fire." The squad froze, confusion flashing in their eyes. Holding fire meant losing their chance to ambush, meant letting the enemy convoy roll past untouched, but Ward's tone brooked no argument. Seconds stretched painfully, and then the trap revealed itself. Muzzle flashes erupted on the opposite ridge, streams of tracer fire cutting through the rain as enemy machine guns opened up on their position. Bullets tore into the ruins, sending splinters of wood and shards of brick flying, the sound deafening in the storm. The captain shouted orders, scrambling to regain control, but Alpha Squad was already pinned. Men dove for cover, returning fire in blind bursts that did little to suppress the elevated gun nests. Panic threatened to unravel them, until Ward moved. With a calmness that bordered on inhuman, he slid into position, braced his rifle, and exhaled. The world seemed to narrow around him, the storm fading, the chaos muffled. Through his scope, he picked out the faint glimmer of a machine gunner's goggles, a fraction of a second's opportunity. His fingers squeezed and the shot cracked like thunder, a perfect arc through wind and rain. The gunner dropped instantly, his weapon falling silent. Before the squad could even register what had happened, Ward shifted, found the next target, and fired again. Another enemy fell. His movements were precise, mechanical, each shot resetting the balance of the battlefield. Within moments, the weight of fire pressing down on Alpha Squad began to ease, not because the storm lessened, but because one man was dismantling an ambush single-handedly. The younger soldiers stared in disbelief as Ward worked. They had seen him train, seen him correct their stances and discipline their sloppy aim, but none had ever witnessed him unleashed in battle. He was a ghost, a machine of focus and control, as if every lesson he had drilled into them had been carved from experience paid for in blood. The rain slicked down his face, dripping from the brim of his hood, but his hands never trembled. One after another, enemy silhouettes crumpled in the mud, their ambush unraveling as their numbers thinned. By the time the captain regained his voice and began shouting orders to advance, Ward had already broken the back of the attack. The squad surged forward, emboldened, moving with the confidence of soldiers who suddenly believed survival was possible. They took the ridgeline in a storm of gunfire and grit, but it was Ward's single-minded precision that had shifted the momentum. When the final shots faded and the valley grew quiet again, Alpha Squad regrouped in the dripping ruins of the farmhouse, hearts pounding, ears ringing. The captain approached Ward, his voice trembling with both relief and awe. "What the hell was that, Sergeant? Where did you learn to shoot like that?" For a long moment Ward said nothing. He simply reloaded, his motions deliberate, his eyes distant. Finally, he gave a small shrug as if dismissing the gravity of what had just happened. "Long time ago," he muttered. To the squad, it was the first crack in the facade, the first glimpse that their quiet mentor was more than a hardened trainer. Something lingered in the silence after his words, an unspoken recognition that they had not just been saved by luck or by chance, but by a man who carried a legend he refused to name. For the rest of the night, the men whispered less and watched him more closely. Their mentor was not just a soldier. He was something more, someone whose past was woven into the shadows of war itself. And though none of them could prove it, a suspicion began to grow among them. The stories they had traded in half-jest might have been true all along. Dawn came reluctantly to the valley, a pale gray light filtered through ragged clouds that had not yet given up their reign, and Alpha Squad trudged through the mud with the stiffness of men who had seen too much in one night. Their uniforms were soaked, their boots heavy, their nerves raw, but there was a strange current running beneath their exhaustion, an energy that none of them quite knew how to name. They had walked into an ambush and survived, not because of strategy, not because of numbers, but because one man had turned the battlefield into his canvas and rewritten its outcome with every trigger pull. No one spoke of it openly, but every pair of eyes kept drifting toward Sergeant Ward as he walked among them, rifle slung casually across his back as though the previous night's display had been nothing more than routine. He carried himself with the same quiet presence as always, scanning the ridgelines and tree lines, listening to the subtle changes in wind and earth, yet the men who followed him now did so with a reverence they had not shown before. To them he was no longer just a mentor correcting their posture or scolding their hesitation. He was something beyond, a figure whose calm in the storm had saved them from being another set of forgotten names etched into stone. When they reached their forward camp, the squad collapsed into their bunks with the groans of the half-dead, but Ward remained standing, speaking in low tones with the captain near the map table. The young officer's hands moved nervously over the layout of the valley, pointing to routes and supply lines, but his eyes kept flicking toward Ward as if seeking confirmation more than giving orders. It was a subtle shift, one the squad noticed even through their fatigue. Command itself seemed to lean on the older man, as though his judgment had become the anchor holding them steady. Hours passed, the storm finally broke into weak sunshine, and orders came down for the unit to move deeper into enemy-held territory. Intelligence suggested that a high-value enemy commander was operating nearby, directing the ambushes and raids that had harassed their forces for weeks. Neutralizing him could tilt the balance in the region, but the mission was dangerous. Suicide, some whispered. The captain outlined the plan with forced confidence, but when Ward finally spoke, his voice was quiet, steady, and it cut through the uncertainty like a blade. "We'll need patience. He'll be guarded by more than guns. Men like him build traps within traps." The soldiers nodded, not because they understood but because they trusted. The march that followed was brutal. The forest was thick with mist, the undergrowth slick from days of rain, and every step seemed to echo louder than it should in the silence of enemy territory. Ward moved at the front, his senses attuned to details the others would have dismissed. The broken twig that snapped the wrong way, the unnatural stillness of birds, the faint metallic tang of disturbed soil where mines might be buried. He raised his fist to halt them often, and though the pauses gnawed at their nerves, each one proved justified when they later found signs of tripwires or sniper nests. To follow him was to walk a narrow path between death and survival, and slowly, the men began to realize that their mentor was teaching them even now, not in words but in demonstration. Every careful step, every measured glance, every instinct sharpened by years of invisible battles was another lesson, one they absorbed with the urgency of men who knew their lives depended on it. On the third night, they set up a cold camp in the ruins of an abandoned village, the air heavy with the scent of charred wood and damp stone. The younger soldiers huddled together, speaking in whispers about what they had seen Ward do during the ambush, their voices carrying the awe of disciples recounting a miracle. One swore he had seen the sergeant hit a target through smoke so thick he could barely see his own hand. Another insisted the old man must have special equipment, some secret scope or experimental tech hidden in his rifle, though none had ever seen him use anything but standard issue. Ward sat apart, cleaning his weapon with the same meticulous care he always showed, as if their chatter belonged to another world. Yet when one of the privates finally worked up the courage to ask him directly, "Sergeant, were you something else before this?" The older man paused. His eyes lifted from the rifle, meeting theirs, and for a heartbeat the firelight reflected something in his gaze that was neither denial nor confirmation, but a weight of memory that silenced every tongue. "Doesn't matter what I was," he said softly. "What matters is what you'll be when it's your turn." The words lingered long after he returned to his work, planting themselves like seeds in the minds of men who had begun to suspect they were being shaped for something larger than survival. The following morning their suspicions about traps proved true. The squad advanced along a ridge when Ward abruptly stopped, his hand signaling them down. He crawled forward alone, eyes sweeping the terrain, and then pointed toward a cluster of rocks ahead. At first the soldiers saw nothing unusual, but when they looked closer under his guidance, they noticed the faint shimmer of camouflaged netting, the slight curve of barrels hidden beneath foliage. An entire enemy platoon lay in wait, positioned to massacre them the moment they crossed into the open. Without Ward's intervention, it would have been another slaughter. Instead, under his direction, Alpha Squad maneuvered silently around the kill zone, encircling their ambushers, and when the clash came, it was the enemy who fell into chaos. The engagement was swift, brutal, and decisive, but more than the victory itself, it was the way Ward had read the land, seen what no one else could, and turned inevitability into opportunity that etched itself into their minds. The whispers about his past grew louder in the privacy of their thoughts. Some began to believe he had once been the legendary phantom sniper spoken of in barracks tales, the man who had vanished after reshaping entire battles with a single bullet. The possibility was intoxicating, terrifying, and unspoken aloud, but every day with every step, it felt more true. By the time they reached the valley where the enemy commander was rumored to be operating, the squad had changed. They moved with sharper discipline, their confidence rooted not in bravado but in the quiet assurance that came from following a man who saw further than they could. They no longer questioned his orders, no longer hesitated when he gestured or whispered a command. It was as though his legend, whether real or imagined, had seeped into their bones and made them stronger. Yet Ward himself remained unchanged, silent and watchful, carrying his rifle with the ease of a man carrying his shadow. He never acknowledged their stares, never indulged their curiosity, but each time his finger steadied on the trigger, each time another unseen danger was revealed by his eyes alone, he confirmed what they already knew but could not say. They were in the presence of someone who had already become part of war's history, someone whose single shot might yet decide the future. The valley stretched before them like a wound carved into the earth, its slopes jagged with rock and thick with mist that clung to the ground in ghostly veils. An Alpha Squad crouched low at its edge, their breaths shallow, their nerves sharp. Somewhere down there, hidden in the labyrinth of ruined bunkers and scattered trees, was the enemy commander whose presence had poisoned the region with ambushes and raids. 4 days they had followed faint trails, intercepted coded transmissions, and survived traps designed to erase them, and every time they had emerged intact, it had been because Ward's eyes saw what theirs could not. Now, as dawn's pale light began to creep over the horizon, the squad looked to him once again, waiting not for orders from the captain but for the subtle nod or gesture that meant safety or death. Ward scanned the terrain with his scope, his face unreadable, his body utterly still. He had been this way for hours, lying on his stomach against the damp earth, ignoring the cold that bit through their fatigues. Finally, he exhaled, lowering the rifle, and the squad leaned forward unconsciously, as if the rhythm of their survival had been tied to the cadence of his breath. "He's here," Ward said simply, and the word sent a shiver through them more than any artillery strike could. The captain tried to reassert his authority, outlining the approach routes and fallback positions with a whisper, but it was clear even he deferred to the sergeant's quiet certainty. Ward tapped the map with a gloved finger, tracing a line that bypassed the obvious trails and instead hugged the shadow of the ridge where the fog pooled thickest. "He'll expect the direct path. He won't expect us where the mist is blindest," he murmured. The squad nodded, trusting him, and they moved out like shadows swallowed by the valley. Every step was deliberate, every breath measured as they descended into the shrouded basin. The silence pressed heavy on them, broken only by the distant drip of water and the occasional rustle of wind through the skeletal branches. Twice, Ward raised his hand and they froze, hearts thundering, until the danger passed. A patrol they never would have seen without him, a claymore mine hidden with uncanny patience. His presence was the difference between walking into death and walking past it untouched, and the men felt that difference with each passing hour. At last they reached the ruins of an old bunker complex, half buried in earth and overgrown with moss, its concrete scarred by battles long past. Through the fog they could just make out figures moving with purpose, enemy sentries guarding something deeper within. The squad crouched low, exchanging silent glances, and the captain raised his hand to signal an assault. But before it could fall, Ward touched his arm, stopping him. "Wait," he whispered. He studied the guards, the way they moved, the timing of their rotations, the discipline in their posture. Then his eyes narrowed, catching something others would have missed, the glint of a sniper's lens far up the ridge, aimed not at the valley but at the entrance where anyone bold enough to rush would be cut down in seconds. "He's baited it again," Ward said softly. "The commander wants us to rush. He's watching." The realization spread through the squad like cold water. They weren't facing a careless officer. They were hunting someone who understood war as deeply as Ward himself did. It wasn't just a battle of weapons but of minds, and in that moment the soldiers understood that their survival would come down to which man could outthink the other. Ward lay flat, sliding his rifle into position with the patience of stone. The scope glinted briefly before he shielded it with his hand, adjusting for the angle, the mist, the wind curling through the valley. His finger rested against the trigger but he didn't fire. Seconds bled into minutes, the squad holding their breaths, the tension drawing so tight it felt like the earth itself might snap. Then Ward saw it, a flicker of reflection that betrayed the hidden sniper, just a sliver of movement where none should have been. In the same heartbeat, his rifle cracked, the sound swallowed by fog, and the enemy's overwatch went silent. The squad almost exhaled in relief, but Ward's eyes never left the ruins. He had fired not just to kill but to announce. Somewhere in those bunkers the enemy commander now knew his trap had been seen, his sniper countered. Somewhere, a man of equal cunning would be adjusting his plan, and Ward would be ready. The squad advanced with surgical precision, slipping past the outer guards in a coordinated rush that Ward directed with nothing more than hand gestures and a cold certainty. They breached the first bunker, clearing rooms thick with dust and the smell of rusted iron. Resistance was sharp, but it faltered under their momentum, the enemy unprepared for the speed with which Alpha Squad struck. Still, Ward's focus was elsewhere, always deeper, always searching for the shadow behind the fight. He could feel it, the presence of the commander, a mind that mirrored his own in patience and in cruelty. Every step into the warren of tunnels was a step closer to the inevitable confrontation, though none of the younger soldiers fully grasped it yet. To them this was another mission, another objective to seize. To Ward, it was something more personal, a collision of histories unspoken, as though fate had drawn him back from anonymity to settle an old score. The fighting grew harsher as they pushed deeper. Grenades thundered in the confined spaces, bullets sparked against concrete, shouts echoed in the labyrinth. Men stumbled, bled, and kept moving, driven by adrenaline and the belief that Ward's guidance would carry them through. At one choke point, pinned by overlapping fields of fire, it was Ward who slid forward on his stomach, calm as if on a training range, placing precise shots that dropped defenders in sequence until the gap opened. At another, when a booby trap threatened to shred them in the narrow passage, it was Ward who noticed the faint tripwire glistening with moisture and disabled it with the steadiness of someone who had done so hundreds of times before. Each act etched deeper into the squad's memory the truth they had begun to whisper in private. He wasn't just a mentor, he was a legend hiding in plain sight. At last, they reached the central chamber of the bunker, a cavernous space lit by flickering lamps and crowded with crates of ammunition. And there, at the far end, stood the enemy commander. He was not the image of a reckless officer. He was calm, tall, his uniform immaculate even in the ruin, his hands folded behind his back as though he had been expecting them. His soldiers raised their rifles, but he lifted a hand and they hesitated, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. Then his gaze shifted, not to the captain, not to the squad, but directly to Ward. Recognition passed between them in a silence heavier than any gunfire. "I wondered if it would be you," the commander said in accented English, his voice steady, almost respectful. The squad glanced between them, bewildered. What did he mean? Who was he talking to? Ward's jaw tightened, but he gave no answer, his rifle steady, his silence louder than words. In that moment, the squad understood what they had only suspected. Their mentor was not merely skilled, not merely seasoned. He had a history tied to enemies who remembered him, enemies who feared him, enemies who still carried scars carved by his bullets. The air in the bunker grew thick as the standoff stretched, the soldiers waiting for a signal, for the eruption of violence. And then, with a suddenness that left no room for hesitation, the commander snapped his hand down and his guards opened fire. The chamber erupted in chaos, the squad diving for cover, bullets sparking off steel and stone. But in the eye of that storm, Ward moved with lethal calm. His first shot dropped the nearest guard, his second took another through the throat, his third shattered a lamp and plunged half the chamber into shadow. He wasn't just fighting, he was controlling the battlefield, bending light and fear and sound to his will. The squad fought hard, inspired and shielded by his precision, pushing forward inch by bloody inch. And as the enemy fell, one truth became undeniable. This was not a mission led by a young captain, nor by chance. This was a duel written long ago, one that only Ward could end. The battle inside the bunker raged with a fury that swallowed sound and time alike, muzzle flashes strobing against the concrete walls as Alpha Squad fought tooth and nail to carve a path through the enemy. Smoke filled the chamber, choking and acrid, curling into their lungs as bullets tore through the air in screaming ricochets. Men shouted in fragmented bursts, some out of command, others in raw survival, but above it all was the steady, unyielding crack of Ward's rifle, each shot a punctuation that turned chaos into rhythm. He was everywhere at once, it seemed, dropping to one knee to fire, shifting behind a crate to reload, sliding across the floor to a new angle without ever losing his composure. Where the younger soldiers fired in bursts of panic, Ward's trigger finger spoke with surgical finality. One shot, one fall, another shot, another silence. It was as though the entire fight bent itself around his presence, a storm with a calm, deadly center. The squad advanced, spurred by his example, pressing deeper into the chamber, the smell of cordite sharp and burning in their nostrils. The enemy fought with fanatic determination, but their lines began to crumble under the relentless pressure. Ward's precision carved gaps where none should exist, and the squad poured through those openings with a mix of courage and desperation. The captain tried to call maneuvers, but more often than not, the soldiers' eyes followed Ward's gestures instead, their trust anchored in him as though the official chain of command no longer mattered. It was his war now, his duel, and they were simply the instruments by which it would be played. At the far end of the chamber, the commander moved with a calm arrogance, his own pistol flashing as he barked orders. Even in the chaos, his gaze kept finding Ward as though the rest of the fight was incidental, background noise to the inevitable clash between them. The enemy commander retreated strategically, drawing the fight deeper into the complex, using his knowledge of the terrain to stall and frustrate. Every corner was another choke point, every passage another ambush, yet every trap that should have bled Alpha Squad dry was countered by Ward's instincts. He sensed tripwires before they touched them, anticipated flanking maneuvers before they unfolded, and struck with a timing that seemed almost supernatural. At one point, when the squad became pinned in a narrow corridor, two machine guns hammering them from intersecting angles, it was Ward who rolled a flash grenade with uncanny precision, blinding the gunners long enough for the squad to storm forward. His presence made survival possible, but more than that, it made the impossible feel achievable. They began to fight not like men clinging to life, but like soldiers chasing victory, and that change electrified every movement. Still, the cost was brutal. One by one, men fell, wounded or worse, their cries echoing in the suffocating dark. Blood stained the floors, mixing with shattered stone and shell casings. The squad pushed onward with thinning ranks, each loss hammering at their resolve, yet Ward's figure ahead of them never faltered. He moved like a shadow that could not be touched, and even as exhaustion threatened to break their bodies, they drew strength from him. For the first time, they began to understand the true weight of his past, that this was not the first slaughter he had walked through, nor would it likely be the last. Whatever scars marked his face, they were nothing compared to the ones carved deep inside him, scars earned by surviving where others had perished. That realization, unspoken but undeniable, transformed their fear into a grim determination to match the standard he set, even if it killed them. At last, they cornered the enemy commander in the deepest chamber of the bunker, a vast subterranean hall lined with rusting fuel drums and crumbling support beams. Fires burned in scattered patches where grenades had ignited supplies, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The commander stood at the far end, his pistol in hand, flanked by the last of his guards. His uniform was smeared with soot, his face streaked with grime, but his posture was unbroken, his eyes bright with something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. "You've come far," he called across the chamber, his voice echoing. "But you know this ends with one of us. The rest of them, your men, my men, they're just pieces on the board." His gaze locked on Ward again, dismissing all others as irrelevant. "I have waited years for this." The squad exchanged bewildered looks. Years? None of them could fathom what kind of history lay between their mentor and this enemy officer. But Ward's silence confirmed it. This was not chance, not coincidence. This confrontation had roots buried deep in wars the rest of them had only read about in training manuals. He lifted his rifle with steady hands, the firelight dancing in his scarred features, and for the first time, the squad saw not just their mentor, but the legend he had tried so hard to bury. The commander gestured sharply and his guards opened fire, the hall exploding with violence once again. Ward returned it with terrifying efficiency, each shot a death sentence. The squad fought at his side, diving behind cover, exchanging bursts, lobbing grenades into clustered defenders. One by one the commander's guards fell, their cries lost in the thunder. Yet the commander himself moved with uncanny luck, ducking into cover, firing with precision, his presence a constant threat. In the crescendo of battle, Ward's rifle cracked, and the final guard collapsed, leaving only the commander standing. Smoke drifted through the chamber, firelight painting both men in hues of orange and black. The squad held their breaths, weapons raised but unwilling to intervene. This was no longer their fight. It had never been their fight. This was a reckoning between two ghosts of the battlefield, men forged in shadows and blood, and whatever happened next would be carved into the marrow of every survivor who watched. The commander lowered his pistol slightly, his mouth curling into a faint smile. "You should have stayed gone," he said almost gently. "But you couldn't, could you? You can't live without the war." Ward's expression did not change. He said nothing, only steadied his rifle, his silence more damning than any retort. For a long, unbearable heartbeat, neither man moved, the air heavy with the inevitability of what was to come. And then, almost too fast to follow, both raised their weapons. The shots cracked almost as one, thunderous in the enclosed chamber. For an instant, it seemed impossible to tell who had fallen. Smoke curled upward, the fires roared, the squad's hearts stopped. Then the commander staggered back, a bloom of red spreading across his chest. His pistol slipped from his hand, clattering to the ground, his knees buckling. He looked up at Ward. With an expression that was half shock, half grudging respect, and whispered words none of the squad could hear before collapsing onto the concrete floor. Silence followed, heavy and absolute, broken only by the crackle of flames. Ward lowered his rifle slowly, his breath steady, his face unreadable. For a moment the squad thought he might say something, some revelation, some confession, but instead he simply turned away, checking his weapon as though nothing had happened. To him, it seemed, the duel had been inevitable, and its outcome nothing more than another chapter in a story he refused to tell. The squad stood in stunned silence, the truth pressing down on them like a weight. Their mentor, the quiet man who had trained them, who had corrected their clumsy grips and scolded their careless aim, had just revealed himself not by words but by action. He was the legend whispered about in barracks, the phantom sniper who had vanished from history. No one knew his name in the official records anymore, but now they knew. And though none dared speak it, each man understood that he had just witnessed the moment when myth became undeniable reality. The silence that followed the commander's death stretched on like an endless void, broken only by the faint hiss of smoldering fires and the slow drip of water seeping through the cracked concrete ceiling. Alpha Squad stood frozen in the flickering shadows, weapons still raised though there was no one left to fight, their eyes locked on the still figure of Sergeant Ward. He didn't speak, didn't bask in victory, didn't acknowledge the awe radiating from the men around him. He simply lowered his rifle, inspected it with the same meticulous calm as if he had just completed another training exercise, and slung it across his shoulder. To him this was not glory. It was survival, inevitability, the conclusion of a path set long ago. The younger soldiers struggled to reconcile what they had just witnessed, their minds clashing between the image of the mentor who had drilled them on the firing range and the phantom who had faced down a commander with the confidence of a man who had rewritten death's rules. The captain finally found his voice, shaky but loud enough to echo across the chamber. "Secure the area. Collect weapons. We're moving out." His words rang hollow, as though he too knew that command had already shifted, not officially but undeniably, to the scarred man who stood silent before them. They worked quickly, clearing the chamber, dragging crates into defensible positions, tending to the wounded. The squad's numbers had been thinned by the fight, their faces pale with exhaustion and grief, yet every glance kept drifting back to Ward. The legend was no longer rumor. It was flesh and blood breathing beside them, walking in their midst. Some of the younger soldiers exchanged hushed words, their voices trembling with disbelief. "It has to be him," one whispered. "The stories, they all said he disappeared years ago after that war in the mountains." Another shook his head, though his eyes betrayed doubt. "No, that's just a tale. He's too real. Too ordinary." But ordinary men didn't do what they had seen, didn't move with the precision of inevitability, didn't stare down ghosts of their past with silence sharp enough to cut through the smoke of battle. They all knew it, though none dared speak it aloud. Their mentor was the phantom sniper, the one whispered about in every barracks across half the continent. Ward gave no confirmation. He spoke only when necessary, directing the squad through the bunker's aftermath with calm authority. When they moved back through the tunnels, he led them, eyes sweeping every shadow, every crack in the walls, as though danger could still spring from the darkness. Outside, dawn had fully broken, casting pale gold across the valley. The mist was burning away, and with it, the veil that had shrouded their understanding of who walked beside them. The squad climbed the ridge slowly, their boots dragging through mud and blood, their bodies aching from hours of combat. At the top, they collapsed into defensive positions, setting up a perimeter while they awaited extraction. The captain attempted to radio command, his voice steady but his hands trembling. When he reported their success, the enemy commander neutralized. There was a stunned silence on the other end before command confirmed reinforcements were en route. Yet even as the captain relayed details, his eyes kept drifting toward Ward, the unspoken acknowledgement clear. None of this would have been possible without him. The hours that followed were filled with a restless quiet. The men cleaned their weapons, patched their wounds, and tried to shake the images of the nightmarish battle from their minds. Yet none could escape the memory of Ward standing in the firelit chamber, rifle steady, silence heavier than thunder, ending a duel that had been written in blood long before they ever knew his name. Eventually, one of the younger soldiers, nervous, barely more than a boy, summoned the courage to approach him. "Sergeant," he said hesitantly, "who was he?" "That commander. He knew you. He said you should have stayed gone." Ward's scarred face turned toward him, eyes steady but unreadable. For a moment, it seemed he might dismiss the question with silence, but then he answered with a voice low and tired. "He was a reminder," Ward said. "A piece of the war I left behind." The boy frowned, confused, but Ward offered no more. He picked up his rifle, checked its chamber, and walked away to stand watch at the ridge's edge. It was the closest they would get to an admission, and it only deepened the mystery that clung to him. When reinforcements arrived, Alpha Squad was extracted back to the forward base. The victory spread quickly through the camp, soldiers whispering of the squad that had eliminated the enemy commander and broken the ambush chain that had strangled their forces for weeks. Yet within those whispers, another story began to take root, one carried by Alpha Squad themselves in half-said words and stolen glances. They spoke not of strategy, not of luck, but of one man whose rifle had rewritten the battlefield, whose silence carried the weight of legends. The base erupted with questions when they returned, other soldiers pressing for details, but the squad held their tongues. They were loyal not just by duty but by awe, unwilling to betray the man who had carried them through hell. Still, stories have a way of escaping, and soon rumors spread further. Rumors that the phantom sniper, thought dead or retired, had returned to the war. Command took notice quickly. The captain was summoned for debriefs, pressed for details, asked to confirm or deny the rumors. He gave careful answers, speaking of the squad's courage, the enemy's traps, the intensity of the fight. But when asked directly about Sergeant Ward, his voice faltered. "He's the best soldier I've ever seen," was all he said, leaving the rest unspoken. Higher-ups exchanged knowing looks. They had heard the rumors too. In their minds, if Ward truly was the phantom sniper, then his return was a weapon more powerful than artillery. But Ward himself refused to play into it. When officers questioned him, he responded with curt professionalism, nothing more. He gave them facts, not stories, tactics, not history. Yet no one could look at him without wondering, and no soldier could meet his eyes without feeling the weight of battles fought long before their time. Life at the forward base resumed, but Alpha Squad was never the same. Their bond with Ward deepened into something almost reverent, each man watching his movements, absorbing his lessons with a fervor born of belief. Every correction he gave was taken as scripture, every gesture a command more absolute than any order barked by the captain. They began to train harder, sharper, no longer just surviving but striving to rise toward the impossible standard he represented. Ward noticed, of course, but he said nothing. He simply continued as he always had, quiet, precise, deliberate. Yet inside, he felt the stirrings of something he had long buried. These men were more than students now. They were witnesses. They had seen his past break through the veil, and whether he liked it or not, they had become the inheritors of his legend. Still, Ward knew the war was far from over. The death of one commander was a victory, but it would provoke retaliation. The enemy would not forget, just as the man in the bunker had not forgotten. They would come harder, with more traps, more fury, because legends draw fire as much as they inspire. As Ward stood on the perimeter one evening, the sun sinking behind jagged hills, he watched the horizon with eyes that had seen too many dawns and too many graves. His squad believed they had glimpsed his true self, but they had only scratched the surface. The war was not finished with him, not yet. And somewhere, in the silence between gunfire and peace, he wondered if it ever would be. The days that followed their return to base blurred together in a haze of drills, patrols, and whispered rumors that spread like wildfire through the camp. Soldiers from other units kept sneaking glances at Ward as if they were looking at a ghost who had stepped out of their stories, the man whose name had once been spoken in hushed tones across countless barracks fires. The younger recruits especially couldn't hide their curiosity, their eyes following him whenever he passed, as though his mere presence confirmed every legend they had ever heard. But Ward gave them nothing, no acknowledgement, no confession, no hints of pride. He moved through the base with the same cold precision he had always carried, performing his duties as though he were just another soldier. Yet Alpha Squad knew better, and with every stolen glance at their mentor, they carried the secret of who he truly was. Still, secrecy is a fragile thing in war, and Ward understood that each passing day only tightened the net around him. Command was asking too many questions and enemies had long memories. He had shown his hand on the battlefield and sooner or later, someone would come to collect the debt. That certainty arrived faster than he expected. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in bruised purples and dying reds, the base perimeter alarms shrieked to life. The enemy had found them. Mortar fire screamed across the horizon, exploding into gouts of earth and flame that threw men and equipment into chaos. Alpha Squad scrambled from their bunks, weapons in hand, diving into defensive positions as shells pounded the outer barricades. Ward was already moving, shouting orders with a clarity that cut through the panic, his voice firm, unshaken. Stay low. Find cover. Return fire only when you have a clean shot. His presence steadied the men, even the most terrified recruits clinging to his commands like a lifeline. Explosions rocked the ground beneath them, but Ward moved as though he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times before, guiding soldiers to safety, dragging the wounded from burning trenches, setting up firing lines with ruthless efficiency. Through the haze of smoke and dirt, Ward's eye caught something most others would have missed. A sniper's glint from the treeline beyond the ridge. In that instant, time seemed to slow, the roar of battle fading into silence. He knew that glint. The enemy hadn't just stumbled upon their base, they had sent specialists, marksmen who knew how to hunt hunters. This wasn't random shelling. It was a strike meant to test him, to draw him out. Without hesitation, Ward grabbed his rifle and crawled through the mud toward a vantage point. He didn't tell the others what he saw. He couldn't. If the squad knew he was about to face a ghost from his old world, they would follow, and he couldn't risk them being pulled into his shadow. This was his burden. He reached the ridge, belly pressed against the earth, and waited. His breathing slowed, steady as stone, his scarred hands moving with the same ritual precision they always had. Check the chamber, adjust the scope, find the wind, wait for the heartbeat between chaos. The sniper across the field fired first, the shot whistling past Ward's ear and splintering a rock inches from his skull. He didn't flinch. His rifle barked in answer, muzzle flash tearing the darkness, the recoil settling against his shoulder like an old friend. The duel began, a deadly conversation carried in flashes of light and whispers of death. Each shot was a question, each return an answer, two ghosts speaking in the only language they both truly understood. Around them, the larger battle raged, mortars fell, men screamed, orders were shouted, but none of it mattered in that narrow corridor of focus where only two men existed, locked in a war older than the one their armies fought. Ward adjusted, shifted, anticipated. He could feel the enemy's skill in every shot, the hand of someone trained, someone who might have studied the same doctrine he had once written in blood. It was almost familiar, unsettlingly so, as though he was staring at a mirror warped by years of silence. The duel dragged on through the chaos, neither sniper yielding. Ward crawled along the ridge, shifting positions between each shot, his mind calculating angles, distances, the rhythm of his enemy's fire. Then came the moment he had been waiting for, a pause, slight but telling, as the other sniper reloaded. Ward exhaled slowly, the world narrowing to a single breath, a single line of sight. He squeezed the trigger. The shot cut through the smoke, through the chaos, and the glint vanished. Silence followed, heavy and undeniable. The duel was over. But Ward didn't feel triumph. He felt the familiar weight settle deeper on his shoulders. This was the life he had tried to leave behind, and it had come crawling back, dragging him into the same old patterns of death and silence. He rose from the mud, rifle still hot, and returned to the base where Alpha Squad fought desperately to hold the line. He threw himself back into the battle, rallying the soldiers with a calm they clung to like salvation. Under his direction, firing lines tightened, mortars were countered, and the enemy advance faltered. Alpha Squad fought with a ferocity they had never known, their training under Ward crystallizing into instinct. They moved as one, covering each other, advancing and retreating with precision, their confidence unshaken even as shells ripped the earth apart around them. By dawn the base still stood. Smoke rose in columns across the field where the enemy had withdrawn, leaving behind bodies and shattered weapons. The men were bloodied, bruised, but alive. Alpha Squad gathered in the wreckage, their breaths ragged, eyes wide with exhaustion and disbelief. And again their gazes turned to Ward. They had seen him vanish into the ridge, had heard the sharp rhythm of his rifle through the chaos, and they knew without being told that the tide had turned on the back of his skill. This time the silence was different. It wasn't confusion or suspicion, it was reverence. The squad looked at him as though he were not just a soldier, not just their mentor but something more. They didn't dare speak it aloud, but the truth hung heavy in the air. They were following a legend. And Ward could feel it too, the way their eyes lingered, the way their shoulders squared when he stood among them. He hated it. Not because of pride but because he knew what legends drew: attention, enemies, expectations too heavy for any man to carry. But the truth was out now, burned into the battlefield by the echo of his rifle. The world would know, sooner or later, and the war would twist to meet it. As the squad stood amidst the ruins, the captain finally stepped forward, voice hoarse but steady. "Sergeant," he said, locking eyes with Ward, "that shot tonight, it changed everything. Not just for us but for this war." Ward looked at him, silent, scarred face betraying nothing, and then turned his gaze back to the smoking horizon. He knew the captain was right. The battlefield had been rewritten, and he was the one who had done it. The smoke lingered over the battlefield for days, a grim veil that refused to lift even as the wounded were evacuated and the dead buried in shallow graves near the ridge. The base bore scars from the assault, collapsed barricades, burned-out vehicles, craters carved into the earth like open wounds, but it still stood, defiant against the enemy's attempt to erase it. Alpha Squad moved through the ruins with quiet determination, helping with repairs, clearing debris, and sharing their rations with those who had lost everything in the barrage. Yet even in those mundane tasks, their every movement carried a new weight. They were no longer just soldiers of the line. They were the men who had stood beside the Phantom, the ones who had seen with their own eyes what legends could do when the world threatened to collapse. The story spread faster than fire, carried from lips to ears, growing sharper with every retelling. One shot rewrote the battlefield, they said, and though Ward never admitted it, the squad knew the story was true. They had lived it. Ward tried to drown himself in routine. He trained the younger recruits with the same relentless precision as before, correcting their stances, drilling them on discipline, forcing them to rebuild their instincts until they no longer hesitated under fire. He repaired weapons, cleaned his rifle until it gleamed like steel carved from the night itself, and kept to himself whenever he wasn't needed. But he could feel the difference pressing in from every side. Soldiers stopped when he passed, conversations died mid-sentence, and even the highest-ranking officers gave him the kind of wary respect reserved for men who carried shadows too dark to ignore. He didn't want their reverence. It made him a symbol, and symbols always attracted bullets. But he knew it was too late to undo what the battlefield had revealed. His silence was no longer enough to keep the past buried. The summons came 3 nights later, long after most of the base had fallen into restless sleep. The captain entered the barracks quietly, his face drawn and serious, and told Ward that command wanted to see him. The rest of the squad stirred, half awake, their eyes filled with questions they didn't dare voice. Ward simply nodded, stood, and followed the captain into the cold night air. They walked across the camp in silence, the weight of unspoken truths pressing between them, until they reached the command tent where a handful of high-ranking officers waited. Maps were spread across the table, lines drawn in red and black ink marking enemy positions and choke points. But their eyes weren't on the maps. They were on Ward. "Sergeant," one of them began, his tone sharp but cautious, "we've had reports. Stories from your squad. Stories from across the front. They say a sniper, an impossible sniper, turned the tide of the last battle. They say he's one of ours." The officer paused, studying Ward's expression. "We need to know if it's true. We need to know if the Phantom is back." The tent fell silent, the weight of their stares pressing against him. Ward stood motionless, his scar catching the lamplight, his face unreadable. He could have lied, could have denied everything and slipped back into obscurity, but denial would change nothing. The battlefield had already spoken. Finally, he said in a voice low and steady, "I do what I must to keep my men alive." It was not an admission, not exactly, but it was enough. The officers exchanged looks, and in those looks Ward saw the truth. They would not let him walk away now. From that night on, everything changed. Command began to weave him into their plans, sending Alpha Squad into missions where the odds were stacked and survival seemed impossible. They believed Ward's presence would tip the scales, that his rifle could bend fate itself. The squad followed him willingly, almost eagerly, driven by the unshakable belief that as long as he walked with them, death would hesitate. And time after time Ward proved them right. Ambushes shattered under his precision fire, enemy strongholds crumbled when his squad advanced with his guidance, and morale across the front began to shift. Soldiers who had once fought with grim resignation now whispered of hope, pointing to Alpha Squad as proof that legends could walk among them. But with each victory Ward felt the trap closing tighter. He had become exactly what he feared, a symbol. The enemy began to take notice, their attacks growing bolder, their tactics shifting as if they too understood that one man had altered the balance of the war. He saw the signs in every engagement, snipers positioned specifically to counter him, squads moving with strategies that mirrored his own, as though they were studying him, hunting him. The ghosts of his past were awake now, drawn to the sound of his rifle. He could not hide, not anymore. And though his squad saw only victory, Ward saw the cost etched in blood. Every legend came with a price, and he knew that when it came due, it would not fall on him alone. The breaking point came during a mission deep into enemy territory. Command had sent them to destroy a supply line hidden in the mountains, a network of caves and tunnels that kept the enemy fed and armed. The squad moved through the narrow passes under Ward's guidance, shadows pressed tight against the jagged cliffs, their breath misting in the thin, cold air. 4 hours, the mission seemed to unfold perfectly, silent takedowns, explosives planted, the enemy none the wiser. But as they prepared to retreat, the trap snapped shut. Enemy forces poured into the canyon from both ends, cutting off their escape. Dozens of soldiers, heavily armed, moved with precision that betrayed careful planning. They hadn't stumbled into an ambush. They had been led here. And Ward knew with a cold certainty that the bait had been him. The canyon erupted in fire. Alpha Squad fought like demons, their training and bond keeping them alive as bullets tore the rock around them. Ward moved with deadly calm, his rifle singing death from the shadows, but even his skill couldn't erase the truth. They were outnumbered, outflanked, and running out of time. He shouted for the squad to fall back toward a narrow ledge, covering their retreat with shot after shot, each bullet carving a path through the swarm of enemies. The men obeyed, their trust in him absolute, even as fear bled into their eyes. "We're not leaving you," one of them shouted over the roar of gunfire, but Ward cut him off with a growl. "You'll do as I say. Go." His voice carried a finality that silenced any protest. They retreated, hearts heavy, while Ward stayed behind to hold the line, the legend stepping fully into the shadow of sacrifice. Time stretched, seconds grinding into eternity as Ward fired, moved, fired again, his body a machine of war honed by decades of scars. But the enemy pressed harder, closing in, their shouts echoing through the canyon. Then came the moment he had dreaded, a voice clear above the chaos calling his name. Not his rank, not his title, his name. Ward froze, blood running cold. Only a handful of people from his past knew that name, and most of them were dead. He turned, scope finding the source, and saw him. A figure in enemy armor, rifle in hand, face shadowed but unmistakable. The past he had tried to bury had risen in flesh, standing across the battlefield, calling him out not as a soldier but as the man he used to be. For the first time in years, Ward felt something deeper than duty, an old raw fear twisting into rage. The canyon roared with chaos, bullets shredding the stone and smoke curling into the thin mountain air, Yet for Ward the world had narrowed to a single point. The man standing across the battlefield, rifle raised, voice cutting through the storm as if it had been waiting all these years to be heard again. He knew that voice even before his eyes confirmed the shape, the stance, the lethal stillness of the figure who emerged from the enemy line. Time did not blur his memory, it sharpened it, etching every scar of his past into the face he now confronted. The soldier before him was no stranger. He was the last echo of a war Ward had once sworn he had ended, a rival who had survived when the world thought him buried. "You should have stayed gone," the man shouted, his voice cold and certain, carrying the weight of unfinished battles. Ward said nothing. Words had no place here. His answer would be written in the language they both understood, the language of steel and fire and silence that decided who walked away and who became a memory. Alpha Squad, pressed against the narrow ledge behind him, saw the exchange unfold with disbelief. They didn't know the details, didn't understand the history dripping from every look and movement, but they felt the weight of it. This was no ordinary fight. This was a reckoning, something older and heavier than the war they were fighting. One of them tried to step forward, desperate to stand beside their mentor, but Ward barked a single command that froze them in place: "Stay back." His voice was sharper than any bullet, final and absolute. They obeyed, torn between loyalty and fear, their hearts pounding as they realized what was about to happen. Ward had taught them everything he could, had carried them through fire and death, but this battle was his alone. The duel began not with words but with fire. The rival's rifle cracked, the shot slamming into the rock where Ward's head had been a heartbeat before. Ward rolled, found his angle and returned fire, the canyon echoing with the thunder of their weapons. Around them, the larger battle continued, men screaming, grenades blasting, but none of it mattered to the two figures locked in their deadly rhythm. Each shot was an echo of years gone by, each movement a memory of the wars they had survived, and neither gave ground. They were mirrors of each other, killers forged from the same fire, men who had walked away from too many graves. Ward felt his scar burn as though it remembered every shot that had nearly killed him, every duel he had fought, every life he had taken. This was the final chapter, the one he could not escape no matter how far he had tried to run. Minutes stretched into eternity as the canyon became their stage. Ward shifted positions, crawling through the dirt, using every shadow, every sliver of rock for cover, while his rival matched him move for move, a hunter who knew his prey too well. Bullets sparked against stone, the air thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder, each exchange more desperate than the last. Alpha Squad watched with breath held tight, their mentor moving with the calm of inevitability even as the world threatened to consume him. Yet they could see it in his shoulders, in the way his body bent under the weight. This was not just another mission. This was a fight that had waited in silence for years, and it would not end until one man lay still. At last, the rival called out again, his voice cutting across the chaos. "They made you into a ghost, Ward. A story to scare children. But I know the truth. You're just a man and men bleed." The words carried venom, but they also carried recognition, almost respect, as though he knew that killing Ward was not just duty but destiny. Ward's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing through the scope. He didn't answer with words. He answered with a shot that shaved past his rival's cheek, close enough to draw blood. The man smiled through the pain, a twisted grin that spoke of satisfaction. "Good," he shouted. "Then let's finish it." And the battle resumed with a ferocity that shook the canyon, the two of them trading death until the rest of the world blurred into insignificance. Ward knew it couldn't last forever. His body was aging, worn by years of war, scars pulling at every muscle, lungs burning with every breath. His rival was younger, faster, perhaps hungrier, but Ward had something he didn't: patience carved into his very bones, the discipline of a lifetime spent mastering the art of silence. He slowed his breathing, stilled his shaking hands and waited. The rival moved too soon, pressing his advantage, eager for the kill. Ward saw it, the faintest overextension of movement, the slight break in rhythm. It was enough. He exhaled, squeezed the trigger, and the shot rang out like a bell tolling across the canyon. The rival's body jerked, staggered, and collapsed to the dirt, rifle slipping from lifeless hands. The echo of the shot lingered, carrying with it the weight of years. The duel was over. Silence fell heavy, broken only by the distant crackle of fire and the groans of dying men. Ward lowered his rifle slowly, his chest heaving, eyes locked on the still body of the man who had once been his shadow. There was no triumph in him, no celebration. Only exhaustion and a grief too deep to show. He had won, but victory tasted like ash. He turned to Alpha Squad, who stood frozen on the ledge, their faces pale with awe and sorrow. They had seen their mentor fight death itself and win, and they knew without speaking that this moment would become legend, carried across every battlefield until it grew into something larger than life. But to Ward, it was just another scar, another ghost to add to the collection that haunted his nights. The enemy, shaken by the loss of their champion, faltered. Alpha Squad seized the chance, rallying behind Ward as he gave crisp, decisive orders that cut through the fog of battle. They pushed forward, grenades clearing the canyon, rifles driving back the last of the resistance. Within an hour, the supply line lay in ruins, fires consuming the caves, the enemy retreating in disarray. Against impossible odds, they had survived and the mission was complete. Yet as the men cheered and clapped each other on the back, their eyes always drifted back to Ward. They knew the victory belonged to him, to the single shot that had turned despair into triumph. And though he said nothing, though he refused to acknowledge their reverence, they understood the truth. Their mentor was no ordinary soldier. He was the sniper of legend, the phantom who rewrote battlefields. When they returned to base, the story spread faster than ever before. Soldiers whispered of the canyon duel, of the rival who had hunted Ward and fallen to his rifle, of the shot that had ended a chapter of history. Command tried to suppress the details, fearing the weight of legends, but the tale was unstoppable. Men carried it in their voices, etched it into their hearts, and soon the entire front buzzed with the same truth. The legendary sniper had returned and he was fighting for them. Ward heard the whispers everywhere he went, felt the stares that burned into his back, but he ignored them. He had no interest in glory. All he cared about was his squad, the men who had followed him into the abyss and lived to tell the tale. They were his legacy, not the stories, not the myths. One evening, weeks later, Ward stood alone at the edge of the camp, watching the horizon fade into dusk. His scar ached in the cool air, his rifle resting against his shoulder, the weight of years pressing heavy. Behind him, Alpha Squad trained, their laughter mingling with the clatter of rifles and the bark of commands. They had grown under his shadow, stronger, sharper, no longer the uncertain soldiers he had first met. They would survive long after he was gone. For the first time in years, Ward allowed himself a small, fleeting smile. He had fought his past, and though it would always cling to him, he had found something worth carrying it for. His men. His family. His story might be legend, but theirs was still being written. And with that thought, he turned away from the horizon, ready to face whatever battles still lay ahead, knowing that no matter what came, one shot had already rewritten the battlefield forever. The end.